So remember, it's important to remember that Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, which um, eh, being reminded of that fact, whether those Puerto Ricans are living in Puerto Rico or those Puerto Ricans have immigrated to the United States, um, they're U.S. citizens and should be protected like U.S. citizens would be protected. Unfortunately, the response to Puerto Rico was much in line with the response to uh, New Orleans and Katrina. And now, is that response in reference to the populations that were primarily affected were of color? Um, is that a evidence of institutional discrimination? There's a case to be made, but you have to make it yourself. You have to decide yourself. So, um, that movement from Puerto Rico to the East Coast, primarily New York City, was facilitated by affordable air travel between San Juan and New York City, which of course was where the majority of Puerto Ricans ended up establishing themselves. But it was certainly an entry point. Puerto Ricans on the mainland, as I mentioned earlier, remain mostly in New York City. 53% live in the Northeast, and 23% of that population is in New York alone. The rate of Puerto Rican immigration has been very similar to other populations, boom and bust. So when things are going great, you see immigration, and when things start to settle and go into decline, you see uh, a movement of that population, whether it's back to Puerto Rico or somewhere else in the United States. Um, it can be argued that Puerto Ricans are economically diversified, even though the bulk of the group remains concentrated in the lower status. Um, Puerto Ricans are, of course, overwhelmingly Catholic, but Catholicism practiced in the United States in the Northeast is definitely different than the Catholicism that is practiced in Puerto Rico. Um, you do find prejudice in reference to skin color in the island of Puerto Rico, but it was never as it was never seen as a categorical on the mainland. This has left most Puerto Ricans feeling as if they have no clear place in the United States. Puerto Ricans, of course, arrived in the cities the Northeast long after the great wave of European immigrants and several decades after American or African Americans began migrating from the South. Uh, they've it's clear they share many of the same problems with other urban minority groups of color, poverty, lack of education, and high levels of crime. Those Puerto Ricans on the mainland combine elements of both an immigrant and a colonized minority group. And the culture remains really strong and vital. And it's constantly reinvigorated by a considerable movement back and forth between the island and the mainland. Um, Puerto Ricans go home to Puerto Rico quite a bit. And because they have bounced from the Northeast to Puerto Rico, back and forth, they keep those strong cultural traditions intact. Another group is Cuban Americans. When we think about the Cuban Americans, we can say the contact period for Cuban Americans dates back to the Spanish American War. Um, so, despite its nominal independence, the United States remained heavily involved in Cuban politics and economics for decades after the Spanish American War. And U.S. troops actually occupied the island on two different occasions. We still have Guantanamo Bay on uh, the island as we speak. The development of a Cuban American minority group bears little resemblance to the experience of either the Chicanos or the Puerto Ricans. And this is what I mentioned earlier. These groups are disparate groups, and they don't always agree with each other, and they don't always like each other. And to think of them as similar is missing the main central elements of their culture. The conditions for mass immigration um, were created in the late 50s when the Marxist revolution brought Fidel Castro to power in Cuba. So as the Marxist revolution is taking place, we allow immigrants from Cuba to immigrate to the United States. The first Cuban immigrants to the United States tended to come from the more elite classes and included affluent and powerful people. They land primarily in Miami. The U.S. government, of course, welcomes the new arrivals for a couple of reasons. One, they are well off, they're elite, they're affluent. And two, we were waging um, a hot and a cold war against the ideas of communism and Marxism at that time. Many profoundly Americanized Cuban exiles viewed southern Florida as an ideal spot, which they end up landing, and they can then begin to mount a counter-revolution to oust Castro, which of course is in line with what the federal government wants as well. So for several years, immigration was prolific. In 1980, a wave of immigrants generated a great deal of controversy in the United States because the Cuban government used the opportunity to rid itself of a variety of convicted criminals and outcasts. So instead of taking the talent, we get the troubled. Um, and this forces us to reevaluate our immigration policies. However, the Marielitos also included people from every segment of Cuban society, a fact that was lost in the clamor of concern about the undesirables. So, even though the Cuban government is moving some of their criminal element into the United States through immigration policies, it doesn't change the fact that we took in a lot of good people that uh, deserved, if you will, an opportunity to make it in the United States, just like any other immigrant group. Today, Cuban Americans remain one of the most spatially concentrated minority groups in the United States. 70% of all Cuban Americans reside in Florida, with a real high concentration in Miami. Cuban Americans rank higher than other Latino groups on a number of dimensions, a reflection of the educational and economic resources they brought with them from Cuba and the favorable reception they enjoyed from the United States when they got here. So, because they brought wealth with them, so they were mostly coming from advantaged positions in Cuba, and because they uh, gave the United States an opportunity and a platform to argue against the evils of communism, Cuban Americans were given an opportunity to succeed, which is different than most other Hispanic minority groups. Of course, the differences run deeper and are more complex than a simple accounting of initial resources would suggest, as Cubans adapted to U.S. society in a fundamentally different way than the other two Latino groups that we've already talked about. Um, Cuban Americans, we have to think about them in reference to an enclave minority. Um, uh, just to remind you, an ethnic enclave is a social, economic, and cultural subsociety controlled by the group itself, located in a specific geographical area or neighborhood inhabited solely or largely by members of the group, much like Chinatown. The enclave encompasses sufficient economic enterprises and social institutions to permit the group to function as a self-contained entity, largely independent of the surrounding society. So, Cuban Americans have been able to use their wealth to insulate themselves from the trends of the larger society and to, within their enclave, protect the group, the culture, and the hierarchy, if you will, that is Cuban American. Um, Speaking a little bit more about the enclave, because the enclave economy is controlled by the group itself, uh, that's a crucial element of everything that is Cuban American. The ethnic enclave provides a platform from which Cuban Americans can pursue economic success independent of their degree of acculturation or English language ability. So when you don't have to go to the larger society to venture out and make a living, it changes your economic outcomes and your economic potential. The fact that success came faster to Cubans that were less acculturated reverses the prediction of many theories of assimilation. So by retaining your Cuban culture, you had a better opportunity, you had a better chance of making it than by giving it up. And a final qualification, success has been selective and inequality continues to be a problem for Cuban Americans. So just because there's success doesn't mean that everybody's successful. Hierarchies based on wealth and class tend to have economic winners and economic losers. Um, it's essentially what Marx was talking about in the first place, was the differences between the elite and the working classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Cuban Americans are neither the first nor the only group to develop an ethnic enclave, and their success has generated prejudice and resentment from the dominant group and from other minority groups. You can imagine the dominant group doesn't like them because they possess power, and the other minorities groups don't like them because they possess power and they were successful. Higher status Cuban Americans have been stereotyped as too successful, too clannish, and too ambitious. That might be the case, but it's generally uh, you're generally seeing things, labels like that, tossed at people that actually were successful. And the stereotypes of Cubans is an exaggeration and a misperception that just obscures the fact that poverty and unemployment are major problems for many members of this group. So don't get fooled by those that are doing well, because for everyone that's doing well, there's 100 that's probably not.